So welcome from my side. My name is Lihs. I'm an infrastructure consultant at ThoughtWorks, and I'm located in Stuttgart in Germany. And I'm super excited to share the meetup tonight with my two colleagues, Kief Morris from the UK and Chris Ford. And I would ask you to please introduce yourself.
Sure, maybe I'll go first just to break the deadlock. So my name's Chris. I'm an Australian human being, but as a software developer, I think like many people in the audience, I've moved around from country to country quite a bit. And I'm actually, for the last 3 years, I've been working for ThoughtWorks in Spain. So I'm physically in Barcelona, and I guess I'm not a specialist infrastructure person like Michael or Kief. I don't have particular knowledge from that, but as a software developer, I'm really interested in what it takes to get changes into production in a way that stresses me and my team out the least. So this is a topic that I love to talk about.
Hey there, and I'm Kief. I'm an infrastructure specialist and also wrote the book on infrastructure as code. I usually don't mention that, and then people are like, oh, you have to talk about your book. Yeah, and also I just came out with the second edition, which literally just came out. So I like to talk about that a little bit. So I've been with ThoughtWorks about 10 years, and I'm originally from the US, but I've been based in London, the UK for the whole time I've been at ThoughtWorks. Although I've done projects around, I did spend not quite a year working in Munich. That was before we had an office there. So Suzanne, you have I have never seen that office in person. But yeah, I did work for a while out of with a client in Munich with the ThoughtWorks team there. That was a lot of fun. So yeah, I guess that's about enough about me.
Okay, then let's have a quick look at the agenda. As I mentioned in the description of the meetup, it's not going to be a presentation all day long. We will have a short presentation today and hope to come in a good discussion with you around the topic. So we will start with talking about what trunk-based development actually is, and then take a deeper look into how you can support trunk-based development in your development workflow, talk about some tricky questions around it, and then hopefully have a good discussion with you. And before we start, I would like to share a little bit of the history behind this meetup, because I think it's quite funny. So at ThoughtWorks, we have a mailing list, which is called Software Development. It's the main mailing list where most of the interesting software development questions are asked. And there recently was a question around how people do code review in trunk-based development. And then there was a long thread on this topic with many questions and answers and information flowing around. And finally, I think Kief made a little blog post out of, or like a summary out of this. And I read it and found it really helpful and posted it on Twitter. And then some friend of mine from Karlsruhe wrote that he really liked the blog post, but had a few questions and wanted to have an online discussion of this. And that is how this meetup was born, because this online discussion was then transformed into a meetup, and here we are.
I'll just give a little bit more context as well, because this topic is a little bit crazy for me. So I actually posted in the history predates this, because there was a point in one of the internal chats in ThoughtWorks where I made like a joke, where people were talking about pull requests and stuff. And I made a joke that pull requests are kind of like having pull requests for your own development team, as opposed to for like an open source project or something like that, was kind of like having an airport security checkpoint with metal detectors and everything like that on the front door of your house, and telling your family they have to go through that, in order to get into your home. And I made the kind of joke on the internal chat list. And it was actually Martin Fowler who said, oh, you should make a tweet about that. And I was like, oh, I'm not sure that's a good idea to make a tweet about that, but I did. And the thread blew up. I got so many responses. I couldn't look at Twitter because it was just filled with things. And I tried like explaining to people. Part of the reason, or the main reason I wrote this blog post is because I wanted to explain, like, people put so many kind of questions and objections about, oh no, you're wrong because of this, or you're, what about that? And so I just kind of wanted to lay out, okay, this is what I mean. These are the kind of key things really of why I'm saying this. And it was probably like a year, I think, before. It's been a year since after the original tweet that I wrote this blog post. And then of course, Martin then went and tweeted hey, Kief wrote this blog post, and it got even more tweets and even, you know, a bigger and crazier thread. It just never dies. Every day there's like 1 or 2 more people kind of coming in to say, you know, how I'm wrong. So yeah, so that's the history of it. It's just, yeah, it does my head in, you know, but yeah, it's good to kind of talk about it.
So yeah. And I also posted a question on the people who registered with the Stuttgart DevOps Meetup, and wanted to know who of the participants are actually practicing trunk-based development. So this is the result from around 80 people that registered there. You can see that I think it was around 8 people who said, yes, we practice trunk-based development in our team, in our company. There was the big majority did not answer, of course, but 40% said no. So if we take yes or no, it's maybe 1/5 of the people are actually practicing it, which I find is quite interesting. So next up, we would like to introduce trunk-based development as a concept or as a workflow or a practice. And before we do that, we would like to repeat some principles of continuous integration, since I think it's quite important to keep that in mind when we talk about the benefits and the drawbacks of trunk-based developments or of pull requests. So continuous integration is a development practice that requires developers to integrate code into a shared repository at least once a day. It's better if you do it several times a day. And each commit to this repository is then verified and automatically built. The idea of this is that it allows teams to detect problems as early as possible. So in other words, a main idea of continuous integration is early and specific feedback. So we can now investigate in how this goes hand in hand with trunk-based development and what problems arise with pull requests or code reviews. So what we often see in software development projects is people using a source code repository like this. You have a main line, it's denoted with the gray arrow here. And whenever you start working on a feature or on a story, people start creating a feature branch. So the green one, the orange one, and the blue one are all feature branches. Those branches are created at a totally different point in time. And then usually some developers work around this feature, commit to this branch, like the green bubbles or the blue bubbles, orange bubbles. And once they are finished with the feature or the story, they create a so-called merge or pull request and ask for someone to review those changes before they are merged back in the main line. So, for example, with the orange merge request that gets merged back into the main line as the last feature branch, you can see that there are at least 6 commits in the meantime, where the developers of the orange features did not get any feedback from whether these commits still work together with their code changes. They get this feedback rather early. And also the review itself is a kind of a blocking feedback or a blocking review. And it happens quite late. And as Kief just mentioned, the practice probably came up with GitHub, and GitHub became popular. And the idea behind pull requests originally was that untrusted developers who want to make a contribution to an open source project, for example, can easily make a change to a repository, but cannot push into it until a trusted developer reviews it. So I think this is very important to keep in mind, that we are talking about a mix of people you trust and people you probably don't trust, or at least want to see what they do. But usually those are not people working in the same team. But you have a contributor that maybe makes a small fix or adds a small feature to a project. And then you have a committer or someone who is allowed to push to the main branch. And the people from the open source community then review those changes coming in via pull requests. And although this workflow, let's call it, was designed maybe for such scenarios. Nowadays, we see it a lot also in teams where you probably could trust each other a lot more, and you have better ways of doing reviews and collaboration than in such an open source setup. We will come back to this workflow later and the flaw it has in combination with continuous integration. But first of all, let's look how trunk-based development differs from that. So the basic idea of trunk-based development is that every change to the code base directly is pushed to the main line. So there's no such thing like at least long-living branches, but people directly commit to the main branch. Developers also do not wait for a whole story or a feature to be complete before they merge their change. With every, let's say, useful batch of code changes, you do a small commit. Those small commits ideally get immediately integrated in your CI/CD server or pipeline, and you get immediate feedback. Usually this takes less than 10 minutes. This means that the code is continuously tested and integrated as people work on it. So the importance of this is that you do not get a review like 1 or 2 days after you committed the change, but you get this feedback 15 minutes after you did it, 10 minutes after you did it, ideally 5 minutes after you did it, while everything is still fresh in your mind. So you don't have those context switch that you all might know, where you start working on a feature, then send out a pull request, start working on something else, you have your mindset on a completely different topic. And then a few days later, the comment from a colleague comes in. You have to check out the other branch, get everything back into your mind, stop working where you currently worked at. So this is a big interruption of your work. Yeah. From a DevOps perspective, you maybe know this illustration from, I think it's from the DevOps handbook. They are talking about, the authors are talking about the 3 ways to improve your performance or to continuously improve your workflow. So the first way is shipping working software from development to production as fast as possible. That's the first arrow here. And the second way is getting feedback from production back into development as fast as possible and as much as possible, and to establish those feedback loops all along your development workflow. And the third way is speeding up these feedback loops and continuously improving your ways of working. And this being said, we think that code reviews or pull requests are kind of blocking you from getting a fast and specific feedback. Like I said before, you start working on one feature, then send out a pull request, wait for a response. Someone else has to take a look at the code. You kind of stop him working on whatever he or she did before. So there's a context switch for one person doing the review. And then again, there's a context switch for another person who has to incorporate the feedback from the review.
Maybe you could say, Michael, like all those patterns are kind of asynchronous patterns when you have those pull requests, right? So that they may take more or less time, but you're issuing a pull request, someone's reviewing, and it's getting merged, and all those things are asynchronous, which means that you have to context switch to something else to keep busy in the meantime we're waiting.
Or is it more like it's a blocking thing, right? Like it's like a like a threaded system where each thread blocks and waits.
Well, I guess it depends on how you cope with it, right? So let's say you have a pull request, you need someone to approve it. You have 2 options, right? One is I wait and sit there, or I make myself a cup of coffee, or I check my email or whatever. That's the blocking version. And that has problems because I'm waiting as I'm blocked. Or another alternative is, let me start this other thing. And I start to do multiple things at once. And I have to keep in my head the fact that I'm maybe opening multiple things at once that might have dependencies between each other.
Yeah. Another nice way, I think, to look at it is maybe from a lean management perspective. And the main message for me from lean management is you should reduce waste. So how can we motivate trunk-based development from a lean perspective? So reducing waste for me means optimizing for the flow of our software changes from development to production to the customer. So every line of code, every discussion you have, all the time spent in your team only pays out for your clients or for the company once your code is in production. And the more you slow down this way of your increments from development to production, the more money you lose and the more waste you produce. And one, I think, important source or main source of waste is what I think is called change over time when you talk about production lines. So you have a machine producing one piece, and then you have to stop the machine and change its configuration and change its setup to produce another piece. And you try to reduce this as much as possible in manufacturing. But I think people often forget that a similar things happens with developers. So when you start working on a certain topic, you have to build a lot of context in your mind. You have to dig into it. Maybe some people talk about this tunnel that you have to get into, but there is some brain work to be done. And at the moment you get interrupted with this and you have to start with another topic, you have this change over time, right? You are, for a quite significant amount of time, depending on how complex your problem is, you're not really productive. And reducing this change over time, also for developers, I think, is a good start to reduce a lot of waste in your development process. So when we now compare this pull request-based approach of software development with the continuous integration or trunk-based approach, we can see that on the top with the pull requests, we have the orange developer making a change, asking a colleague, the blue one, to review it. If things go good, then the change is merged the first time. There is no response to the review or to the merge request. If there are changes, then there will be a request for change from the blue one to the orange one again. So there is another changeover. The orange developer implements the changes, sends out another pull request, and then probably it's merged. So you have a lot of interruptions. You have some changeovers, and you have a long feedback time until you see where the changes actually get properly integrated in your main line. On the other hand, when you look on the bottom, the green commits, small commits, you get immediate feedback. You do that lots and lots of times. So also the chance for some other commits to cause failure with your changes are much smaller. Other developers also get faster feedback, and you come much more into this continuous integration flow and into this flow of immediate and specific feedback. Now you might argue that you can set up all this also with feature branches. And what I was trying to show here, I don't know whether this is a good picture or not, but I think the main point is that this can become very complex and very tricky when you want to do it with feature branches. So the first question is, what should happen if I push a change to a feature branch and I trigger my CI pipeline? Does it merge the main branch back into the feature branch? Does it take care of other branches that are currently open? Should it try to merge with them? Should it merge everything in main and see whether it still works? Do I get specific feedback for my changes, or do I then get more feedback for things going on in the other branches? I think that is one level of complexity. And if you are working in a microservice environment, for example, and you want to do integration tests with other services, which integration environment do you provide to them? Is it the main branch? Is it a feature branch? Is it something in between? And how reliable is this environment for the other teams to integrate against? and how good and specific is the feedback that you get. So
yeah, I think this was Ulrich's question earlier, actually, in the chat, just to loop it in right now. So Ulrich was asking, well, why is it delayed feedback if I repeatedly and quickly rebase master or mainline back into my feature branch, or I have it done automatically by the CI system? I guess you're making the point, Michael, that simple model would get you some bit of feedback from other things that have been merged into mainline, but it doesn't tell you anything about the activity and all the other feature branches that are happening in parallel. I'm just explicitly tying it back to Ulrich's point.
Does this answer the question then, or should we elaborate more on that?
I think we should say it answers the question, but if there's follow-up questions on it, which there almost certainly will be, then we can tackle them. But Ulrich says yes in the chat. Thanks, Ulrich.
Okay, and maybe some more motivation for trunk-based development. I don't know whether all of you know the book Accelerate. It's based on a survey that the State of DevOps report that was run several years before this book was written, basically on the results of the surveys. And one of the results or the outcome is that there is a correlation between team performance and the lifetime of or the usage of feature branches. And it states that there's a correlation between high-performing teams and at least very short living branches. So they're talking about less than a day, or teams that have worked with a trunk-based approach. That's the one thing you can read up there. And sorry. Yeah, and there's also a correlation between long living branches and less likelihood for teams to do refactoring and intra-team communication. So this also negatively affects, I would say, the quality of the software and the communication in the team. So this being said, you could now think that, okay, from tomorrow on, I just get rid of all my feature branches, directly push all changes into the main branch, and have a good life. But we think it's not as easy as this, and want to give some background and some ideas how you can probably better support trunk-based development in your software delivery, software development workflow.
I'll say, let me just say 1 or 2 points on that. So first of all, there are cases where trunk-based or for pull requests make sense. Again, those kind of open source scenarios. Or let's say you are in an organization, we've been talking in chat about an organization with 600 developers who might be contributing to a piece of code. I would treat that like an open source situation where if I have some code and there's loads and loads of other developers who might be messing with it, I probably would want them to do pull requests if they're not part of the core team that's responsible. And another thing I'll just jump on in terms of the stuff we're talking about in the chat is what happens if you have really short pull requests, right? So if you're doing pull requests, so the thing from the Accelerate book is if you merge all of the work that everybody's working on at least once a day, so that you have everybody's work together and that you're working on in your code base and you're testing it together and all of that, that does meet those criteria of saying that we're essentially doing, so short-lived, sufficiently short-lived pull requests are indistinguishable from trunk-based development, perhaps, except that they have more overhead because you're doing branches and merges and all that kind of stuff. So it's like you've kind of have this, and this is back to my analogy of having the security checkpoint on your front door. It's like, do you really need all of that if you're doing the same thing of having everybody commit?
But to the point of sufficiently short branches being equivalent to trunk-based development, obviously, even in trunk-based development, you've made some changes on your local machine, and there is some period of time before those changes are made visible to your teammates. But if you get it out there quickly enough, then hopefully you won't have gone off in different directions.
Yeah. And there's also the fact that when teams who do trunk-based development are quite good at it, they go much faster. It's not once a day, right? And the pull request mechanisms, I think, impede that. It makes it hard to say I'm going to push every hour, because just because of the overhead. And something that I don't think he's said publicly, but Jez Humble, one of the, the part of the team that produced the Accelerate report and the State of the DevOps report, he has said it, that what they found in the research wasn't just that it's like there's that binary point of once a day where suddenly you get a higher level of performance and no diminishing returns. He says actually the more frequently, if you go more than once a day, the more frequently, again, that correlates to higher and higher performance. So there's definitely a benefit in not sitting back and saying once a day is good enough. Actually, if you can do better than that, you'll do better.
Yeah, I mean, I think I started working in a trunk-based fashion like 1 year ago. And one thing I experienced is that similar to when I started doing test-driven development some years ago, simply sticking to the rule of committing more than once a day with working software had a very positive effect on how I kept my changes small and the software always running also on my machine. So when you try to make really small steps or baby steps, as we call them, and you always think about what is the next smallest step that I can actually change in my software so that I don't break anything or that I only have to write a few lines of code until I have something that works again, I think this has a very positive effect on how you overall work with your software and change your software. So again, here, I mean, it first sounds like a stupid rule, right? Integrate your changes more than once a day, but the positive effect it has on how you work and how your software changes, at least for me, was one of the nice and interesting moments in my career as a software developer. Yeah. So talking about the support for trunk-based development in your workflow, I try to depict kind of a typical software development lifecycle or workflow in this slide. So it starts on the very left with a feature request, a bug, or whatever. You put it in a story, you write it down, you document the changes you want to make. It goes through an analysis process, some planning, you put it on your board, you either, don't know, have sprints or Kanban or whatever. And at some point you kick off the story, you start working on it, try to incorporate a few people. So maybe you incorporate the business, so you incorporate some QA people. And then you start developing on the story and you produce commits. Those commits then go into a CI pipeline. They get built, they get tested. You maybe do a deployment to dev, to a pre-prod environment, at the end to a prod environment. And usually before this deployment to production happens, you have some kind of QA or code review. And I would say that is usually where the merge request happens, or the merge request is created, or the code review is done. And as you can see, this is quite late in your development cycle. So what we are going to show you in the next couple of slides is some ideas how you can actually move these review moments to places early in your workflow, so that you get faster feedback and don't have this feedback at the very end of this process. So the first thing we want to state is that trunk-based development works best supported by other practices that provide early review. And how can you achieve this? So I think it starts with how you do story analysis and how you make this a shared responsibility in your team. I've worked in teams where stories were only written by some PO, and there was a strong dependency or relation between the quality of the stories and the technical experience of the PO. And often you have POs that maybe don't have a lot of technical experience. They come more from a business side. And whenever I started working on such a story, there was a lot of effort to bring it into a shape so that you actually had all the details in it and didn't do the wrong thing at the end. So our recommendation is to include more people into the story analysis, bring in the business side, quality analyst, experience designer, and developers to gather all the information you have for a story or feature, and to really make it ready for dev. Analyze it relatively, put some ideas in the backlog first, but make sure that once you start working on it, it's in a good shape and has all the information you need so that you can really work on it. A very good quality gate in which happens quite early is the estimation meeting. So I don't believe that there is much sense in putting a story point number on a ticket, but the nice effect you get is that if you have 5 people talking about a story and let them estimate a story, you will quickly see whether they have a good shared understanding on what's the effort of the story. So if you get, I don't know, 2 3s and 4 8s, you easily know that something's wrong with the story and that it needs more work and more analysis. So you can do that to check whether the story is really ready for dev. Another nice thing I learned at ThoughtWorks are so-called tech huddles. I didn't know about those meetings before. We usually have them after our stand-up, but that depends from team to team. Some teams have them once a week, some teams have them on a daily basis. But I would say that the idea of a tech huddle is to align the team on a shared understanding of the architecture and the technical side of a story. So in the analysis and the discussions we have with the PO, it's usually more on the business side, understanding the business value of a story, understanding how this fits in the overall concept. And in the tech huddles, it's more about how to align this with your architecture, whether you need bigger architectural changes, whether everyone has the same understanding how it's going to be implemented, also how you're going to test it, how this potentially breaks with existing services or dependencies. And I think the important outcome of this is that you have your team aligned on a topic, on a story, before people actually start implementing it. So this also allows for what I would call a very early review of your concept. It happens much early before you actually would create a pull request or would even create your first commit. Maybe the main principle we use at ThoughtWorks to avoid late code reviews or pull requests is pair programming. In our team, for example, we do not work on a story on our own. It's the absolute exception if we do that. We usually always work in pairs. And besides working in pairs, there are some things around pair programming that make it even more effective. So the first thing you can do is you can rotate the roles within a pair. This usually means you have a driver and navigator. The driver has the keyboard. The navigator maybe takes a look at the open tasks, at the to-dos, has more like a far distance view on the development. Whereas the driver, actually types the code, writes the lines. Then you can alternate the pairing methods. There's things like ping pong or driver navigator, as I just mentioned. This can also be, I mean, probably all of us work remote right now. And this can also be a great idea to kind of bring some alternatives into work routines, right? Try out some new pairing methods, stick to some rules, adapt them, change them, make it fun. Then you can rotate people on and off of a story. So for bigger stories, we usually don't have only one pair working on it, but we rotate people on and off the story, which is a great idea for knowledge sharing in your team. And it also helps you to discover flaws early because different people have a different view on your code, maybe check for different things. And again, here you have the chance for very early feedback on code changes. And last but not least, you reduce the buzz factor a lot. So what happens if one of your team members gets sick or can't work for a long time? You have good knowledge sharing in your team and you are still able to deliver software.
I like to say the lottery factor rather than the bus factor to be a little bit more positive. What happens if your team member wins the lottery?
Nice one. I never heard that.
I think there's probably a connection between the fact these things are made up of multiple interconnected factors and parts and practices, and the fact that talking about this on Twitter goes bad really quickly. Because, you know, when we might talk about it on Twitter, we might be talking about one detail, like the discussion we've already had is like one day enough, or do you need to do it every hour or whatever? And so a tweet is long enough to capture one particular small aspect. But like you were saying, Michael, it's in order to do trunk-based development, there's other knock-on benefits and secondary effects and other practices that you might want to do that work well in conjunction with trunk-based development. So it requires a little bit more of a nuanced exploration of the idea, like Kief's article or your presentation here.
Yeah, one thing I'd like to add to the pair programming is that I think code reviews are also often a way to, I wouldn't say punish juniors, but at least make sure that junior developers do not do any harm to your code base. And I think it's a rather harsh way of teaching people or helping people to learn coding, because they put a lot of effort in their work. They open up the pull request and then they get all the comments, right? And worst case, it's public, other people can read it. Maybe someone has a bad day who reviews the code and doesn't write it in a good fashion. So what I learned from pair programming is that this is a really nice way to onboard people and to help people with their career as a software developer. Because if you have a good team spirit, those people get immediate feedback and don't get a late feedback, and can learn a lot more by pairing with someone who is maybe more senior than writing code and then getting a very late and harsh feedback on what they probably did wrong. So I think pair programming is also a very, very nice way of teaching people and collaborating in general.
I also want to touch on, related to the kind of experience of developers on the team and so on, a couple of folks have brought up the, do you need people to be very experienced and senior in order to work in this way? And I think it's a skill like any other skill in terms of development. And working this way, particularly when the whole team works this way, people pick it up pretty quickly and learn how to do it. And yes, it improves, I think it improves their skill, but I wouldn't say that this is like you must be advanced and only the most experienced programmers can work this way. And it's also one of these things where I think it is important to teach the members of your team, to work with skill, rather than, I feel like sometimes when we talk about these practices, agile engineering practices and things that make highly performing teams, I sometimes think that it becomes an excuse to say we don't want to push people too hard to do better. So we'll find ways to work around that and let people not learn the skills that they probably should learn. It's kind of like exercising. If you don't exercise every day, if you just do it from time to time, you'll never get, you don't get the kind of skills to do it. But if you do it, you learn it and it becomes easier to do. That's just my kind of viewpoint.
So we now maybe talk more about the things in your workflow that support trunk-based development. And now we want to talk about some technical practices to make this a safe thing, right? So I think the first and most important thing is a good test suite that you provide to have a safety net, so that, at the end, you're trying to bring every commit into production, and there is only the pipeline in between you and production that prevents bad code from making it to production, right? And the safety net you provide with a balanced test suite is maybe the most important one. I hope most of you are familiar with the concept of the testing pyramid that I tried to depict here. So the idea is that you probably have two sets of tests. So the one set of tests guarantees that you build the right thing, that you actually create what the client or the customer demands. And the other set of tests is more going into the direction of build the thing right, so that you use the right granularity of your modules, that you have loosely coupled things, that the integration works together as expected, that the interfaces are in place. And the balanced test suite means that you cover both of those aspects. You usually do that with a lot of unit tests that test on a low level whether your individual components work as expected. Then you have a smaller set of integration tests that checks whether all those components work together in the expected way. And at the end, you have a small suite of end-to-end tests, which are rather slow, expensive, and maybe also take some effort to properly maintain them. That guarantee that, I would say, the end user flow works as expected. This being said, you should get a very specific feedback from your tests if things go wrong, where to look at the code and where the things go wrong. And you can also guarantee that all the features your customer pays you for are actually working as expected. A thing I recently learned when working with REST or microservices, that pack tests are a very good idea to guarantee that the contracts between your services work as expected and that you don't break any inter-service communication. So if you haven't heard about them, it might be a good idea to read into that or read that up. Anything to add, Chris, Kief?
No, I think you covered the pyramid pretty well.
Okay. Then we talked a lot about continuous integration. I think there are many talks out there, many videos you can watch on YouTube, many conferences. Just a few best practices. We talked a lot about check-in frequently, so at least once a day. This is to make sure that your code changes work well together with all the other changes that happened during that day, and that you get a feedback at least once a day whether this is the case or not. You should build every commit on an integration machine, and the build should be rather fast. So for me, a rule of thumb is that a build pipeline that takes longer as 10 minutes, I would say it's too slow, right? You should test in an as exact as possible clone of your production environment to assure that you don't have a bad surprise once you deploy to production. You never check in broken code, at least not in the main line. You never check in untested code. We talked about this before. And you don't check in when the build is broken. So a red pipeline means stop coding, fix the bug, fix the problem. Once it's green again, commit your changes again. And don't go home up before checking, don't go home after checking in until the system builds. This sentence is really complicated for me. So this means don't push and go home until you see that the pipeline is green.
For I guess people who are into lean manufacturing, that second last one of not checking in when the build is broken is a similar concept to stop the line. So, in manufacturing, if something is going wrong, we don't want to keep building upon the problem. We want to stop the line, fix it quickly, everyone swarm on the problem, and then we can continue on. And, like many of the other things we're talking about, I guess that's a discipline that the team as a whole, if they're not used to practicing it, might find challenging to adopt. But once you've got that consistent expectation among team members, then it ends up being really good for team flow.
I think the lean people call it the Anden cord or something. It's the thing you pull in the production line and then everything stops. Yeah, and the last thing we want to talk about, how to support trunk-based development, is feature toggles. Unfortunately, there was an overlap with another meetup tonight that had this as the main topic. I'm very sorry for that. It was my fault. I didn't check the calendar carefully. But the idea of feature toggles is that you kind of switch on and off certain branches in your code that are already deployed all the way to production, but at least not active for all the users. So this means you already have your code changes in production. You use the very same build of your software that you use in upstream stages or environments, but you don't make the feature or the change accessible to at least most of the users. You can implement this in different ways. You can also implement it in a way, for example, that allows you to switch toggles on and off during runtime. So you can even, I don't know, use a URL parameter or whatever to test a feature that's already deployed to production while still hiding it from the main audience. And what this allows is that you can build and deploy all your changes all the way through to production, and still wait until a feature is complete. So you do not have to wait with your commits until the feature is complete. You just commit small changes to your code base, get feedback for that, and at the very end, when you finish the feature, maybe at the time where you would create a merge request or a pull request, you can then finally switch on the toggle. And you allow beta users to test your feature while it's incomplete and get early feedback from them as well. Yeah, so that is mainly it. As a short summary, I hope we motivated that it's a good idea to integrate your code changes at least once a day to enable continuous integration. And whenever you look at your development workflow and ask yourself, what can I optimize, or what is a good metric for optimizing my workflow, you can try to optimize for fast and specific feedback. So fast means you get it timely after the change, and specific means it hopefully points you to the, ideally to the line of code that you have to change to fix an issue or to repair your code. Whenever possible, aim for non-blocking or automated feedback. And generally, I think going for a prevent instead of detect approach is also a good idea. So what can you do to avoid a problem in the first place, or to enable your team to produce higher quality software is better than to install a lot of quality gates that then block you from delivering software to production. We also showed that you can distribute reviews all the way through your development lifecycle. You don't have to do it at the very end. Investing in a proper test suite is maybe better than investing in code reviews. Avoid long-living branches. Continuously evaluate and readjust your workflow, and improving intra-team communication always improves code quality and delivery speed. Yeah, this being said, I think it's now time for the tricky questions you might want to ask Kief and Chris and me. So
I already have a bunch, so people can add more, but I think there's already been some awesome questions. There's probably some that we've slightly answered, but I think maybe since people have taken the trouble to add them, I'll cover the interesting ones. Well, sorry, they're all interesting. I'll cover the ones that most resonated with people. So the first one I wanted to cover, which kind of connects to the backstory of this meetup and the fact that, you know, there's been a lot of activity on Twitter, and whenever this gets mentioned, people seem to get really excited. I think, sorry if I'm pronouncing the Hungarian name wrong, Milos was saying, do you have a theory of why most people get defensive about feature branch-based workflow? At least that's his impression. It seems that the benefits of trunk-based development have been well stated for some time and well suited for most. I agree, Milos, at least for closed source situations already. But it's less widespread than pull requests. You know, you can see even from the meetup today, 80% of the people who replied use pull requests rather than trunk-based development. So I guess I'm especially asking you, Kief, do you have a theory as to why this is such a kind of a hot and button topic still?
I mean, I think it's sometimes it just comes from misunderstanding, either misreading the question or misinterpreting, or misreading the statements. or misinterpreting what we're saying when we say that pull requests is not always the most optimal way to do things, especially within a team. People will think like, oh, you're saying that you shouldn't do code reviews, for example. That's one I often get and I actually had one of the kind of Twitter responses. They quoted something I said in the article, but they replaced the word pull request with code reviews, and then explained why I was wrong to say that you shouldn't do code reviews. And obviously we're saying that there's different ways to do code reviews. Pull requests are a way that, so to give kind of the fairness of it, one of the reasons people like pull requests is because it really enforces the code review. It forces you to at least pretend to do a code review. I think one of the things we found internally, somebody on one of our internal mailing lists who talked about this said that they looked at an organization they were working with and the pull request and found that like the vast majority of them, there were no comments and that they seemed to have been done quickly enough that probably somebody was just kind of rubber stamping them, people rubber stamp them through. But it does kind of put that little barrier that forces somebody to at least like actively, not do the code review, as it were. So that's why I think one of the reasons why people get quite attached to it. But what we're saying is that there are other ways to do code reviews that are less disruptive of that flow. Particularly it's that flow of feedback of getting the the changes integrated with what everybody else is working on at the moment and testing them together and so on. So why do people kind of get I guess upset about it? I think another thing is that, as we've talked about, especially the stuff that Michael has gone through in these slides, there are a lot of things that you have to do around it in order to make it work. So you really need to be doing test-driven development in order to make sure that the code that is checked in isn't broken. You need to be doing, well, you don't need to be, what we talked about in the chat around how to handle long-lived pieces of work that take more than a day to complete. You have to do things then like feature toggles. There's also, you have to think about things like how do you design and architect your applications and your code in order to work with this way. So there's a lot of kind of things that you have to do around it. And so I think people get kind of, they see that immediately. Well, how is this going to work? If I look at my code base that I'm working on with my team and the way that they work, we couldn't just have everybody committing straight to trunk because it would cause lots of problems because of all the other things you have to do. And so I think that's part of it as well.
Maybe you could say it's other people as well. So like in the same way, it doesn't make sense without doing the other things around it. It's hard to be the only person on the team who does trunk-based development. It might almost be an anti-social thing to be the one person who does it. So, because you're not meeting other people's expectations and contracts for what it means to be a good team member. So anytime, I guess, a change has to result getting quite a few things right at once, it's just a little bit harder to experiment and discover that, and more likely that if you do just one of the bits and not the others, that you'll have a bad experience, and that'll kind of encourage you to go back to what you were doing before.
Yeah.
Cool. So just to go to the next question, there's actually one that was asked a few times. I think you said a little bit on this, but I think it deserves a little bit more time. So there's 3 questions all related to experience levels. So Hendrik was asking, how do you integrate less experienced developers? Gennady was asking, I think in a ThoughtWorks context, what kind of combination of senior and junior people do we have working? And Daniel was making the observation that their impression was that trunk-based development can only work when all team members are more than just experienced. So I think we covered a little bit comment, but this is a common enough issue that people have when talking about pull requests that I think it's worth specifically maybe speaking about it again. So I don't know, Michael or Kief, do you have a comment on what kind of leverage of junior and senior people do we have, and how does that work?
I've talked about it a bit, so I'll leave ground, but it might be worth talking about like our teams, because we do hire in graduate developers and have them work in teams like this, right?
In our team, we have, I think, a good mix of more senior and more junior people. But I would say we leverage this by taking care of how we do pair programming and how we help more junior people to grow into that. And as I don't know whether I made my idea clear, but I think stopping people from doing things wrong by waiting a long time and then sending them out a bad code review comment, I think is a very, it's a not so nice way of teaching people, right? So you might learn from that when you contribute to open source communities or whatever, but working in a team, I think, offers a lot more and nicer ways to help people becoming better at coding than those quality gates. And yes, it works with a mix of senior and junior people.
Yeah, I'd say on our teams, at least the standard one in Spain might be, you have like one person who is a graduate, a couple of people who have, less than 5 years experience, a couple of senior developers and a lead developer. So, effectively as many people who are experienced and not, I guess my take would be that those engineering disciplines you mentioned, Michael, so having good, good feature toggles, good testing, etc. That's the maturity that's important. It's not the experience of the individuals, it's the maturity of the tech stack that makes it possible and safe for junior developers. And I guess if you were doing trunk-based development without the engineering practices in place, for example, without tests, then maybe actually that would be a difficult place for a junior person to have confidence that they hadn't broken something. Cool. Plenty of other questions. One that Alberto asked, I think Alberto asked you a few but I'm going to ask this one because I've seen it come up on Twitter as well. How do you handle legal and industry regulations that require formal review, more formal than pair programming, before committing to main? So editorializing, I guess Alberto is referring to situations like, I don't know, where there might be a control that says you need 4 eyes, a little bit of an ableist way of putting it, but that you need more than, it should not be possible for one person to affect production without having someone else collaborate with them. I'm going to ask you, Kief, because I've asked you this as well in other times.
Yeah, I mean, this is important. It does come up a lot, obviously, with a lot of our clients. First of all, I'd make that a lot of these conversations around compliance with things like, say, PCI or SOX or national financial regulations and so on. There's a lot of kind of mythology that builds up around them and practices that people assume you have to do. So you see people saying, oh, you have to have 2 different teams. You're not allowed to have a single team, that has includes development and support, for example, which actually turns out not to be the case when you look at the letter of the law. So it's interesting here that the part of the question was around that these regulations might require, a review before committing to main, which I don't think any regulation talks about, like main and branches and those kind of things, right? I think that's more of a policy that a company might have implemented as a way to think about it. It's, as Chris mentioned, it's production, right? It's the fact that you can't have a single person able to make a change to code and push it into production without anybody else being involved. And that therefore you need process around certifying that, right? To proving, when an auditor comes in, you have to be able to prove that every change that you made actually did have, 2 people signing off on it. So some of the things you can do. So pair programming actually can be used to satisfy most of these legal requirements. You do need to have ways of capturing that. So for example, in a way that's going to make the auditors happy. So for example, just having 2 people pairing and committing and putting the names, like we often on projects which don't have that level of requirement, we'll often have people just put their names in. Oh, Chris and Kief, made this commit. You put that in the commit message, which is not, but you might need more than that, right? So we talk about things like, I think Chris, we had some of these conversations around maybe you can do code signing or things like that. So there's things like
if someone wants to build a tool that actually like lets you do something like sign and authenticate with a key or something that pair programming has happened and that the SHA is already okay before it goes in, I'd really love you to do that. Anyone out there who has some good ideas on implementation.
And then the other thing is being able to do it. You can do it on the back end. So one of the assumptions that we make is that when you're committing to the main line, that it runs a build, runs automated tests, and it goes into a pipeline. And in most environments, certainly that I've worked in, it doesn't go straight into production without anybody else. Usually there is a stage where somebody else asked about the role of a QA. Usually there's a stage where, okay, it's passed all of its tests. It's been deployed to a production-like environment and automatically tested there. And now that build becomes available. And so a QA can deploy it and do exploratory testing. Or humans, a human checker can deploy it and sign it off, review code. So if you have that requirement from a legal perspective, you can say the build and also the source code, you can trace back, is progressed along, and there may be a stage in your pipeline where somebody reviews that just as you would a pull request, and has to approve it in an authenticated way before it's allowed to go on and then go into production. And you have that same thing that you have with the pull request of you have that step in the pipeline. I think the issue with all of this is the tooling isn't really there, as Chris was saying about having signing the commits for the pairs. The thing about pull requests, and one of the reasons why this is such a popular way of doing things, is because it's built into most of the the systems, and so it is kind of the lower barrier to entry, as opposed to saying let's come up, we have to make some maybe custom tools or build it into a pipeline.
Yeah, I think usability is a factor. Maybe if people have learned to use GitHub pull requests on their open source projects on the weekend, like they're already familiar with the UI, and it seems natural. I think I might just go back to the manual QA thing, because Tilman did ask that, and just to make sure we cover it. In a process of trunk-based development, does that mean that there's no place? I should use the actual words. Like, what is the place for manual QA in a trunk-based development system? I think what I heard you say, Kief, was that effectively there's just as much of a place as in when you use branches, because you just in both cases, you need a way and an environment to show the changes to the exploratory tester who works out whether it's good. I don't know, Michael, do you have any more to add on the exploratory / manual QA angle?
Maybe it's worth mentioning that we have kind of a manual QA step in our development process, but it's non-blocking. Mm-hmm. So before a story is moved into done, our quality analyst is testing it, and we often get feedback from that. But I would say it's probably things you wouldn't have figured out in a usual code review, because what she does is, she takes a lot of time and does exploratory testing on a running system. And therefore, she kind of needs the feature up and running. She wouldn't find most of her bugs or issues with a static code analysis, so to speak, right?
Yeah, I think that's my experience too, that you would have, if you have an exploratory testing environment, you have the new experimental feature toggled on for that environment. It's off in production, and then the person who's exploring it asynchronously works out whether there's anything wrong, and if there are things wrong, it gets fixed into mainline.
I think it would be nice to lead into this, there's some questions, there are some questions around code reviewing. So we just talked about it in terms of compliance, where it's like required that you record it and have that audit trail that two pairs or two people have looked at it. But there's also some of those aspects that people talked about, like the learning aspects of, for example, with pairing. Okay, the two people are involved in working on it and have that learning from each other. And obviously we do things like rotate and all of that. But how do you get like the whole, more people in the team having the ability to see changes and learn from those kind of things. And I think that, so first of all, I don't think the pull requests necessarily give you that, because there again, it's just a single individual who potentially reviews and approves a pull request. But I think there's some interesting things you can do to get that kind of team learning, for the code base. And one is, again, if you by rotating pairs and having different people work on different parts of the code base, over time, you get that exposure to things and those kind of conversations and the different viewpoints. That's quite valuable. But you can also have sessions. And one of the things you can do to make sure you do code reviews is to make it not necessarily blocking in terms of every change. We're going to make sure that it gets code reviewed at that point in time before it can progress. But to say that on some periodic timetable, maybe once a month or once a week or whatever is the right kind of time period, you sit down as a group and you go through, maybe you go through the history of changes and talk about them, or maybe people talk you through what's more kind of common, I think, that I've seen us do on a lot of our teams, is to have like kind of a showcase where a developer or a pair of developers who built a feature showcase to the rest of the team, hey, look at this way that we did this, and maybe get feedback, but also kind of demonstrate cool things that they did. And so you can have those kind of group discussions, which can be quite powerful. And then a way of combining this with pair programming is to do the mobbing, and to say that actually have the whole team sit down, not necessarily all the time as a way of working, although I have known people who say that they've worked in teams that work this way, but like from time to time, you sit down in a room for a few hours and you work on code, together as a group, and you essentially do super pairing, where it's like everybody participating in that conversation. I found that really useful in learning situations where you're setting up a new team and you're trying to kind of form like, what are our group, our team opinions on good coding style and good design practices, that it kind of, you have that conversation as you code early on. It's really quite powerful.
Makes sense. I thought maybe next we could cover like a nice hard technical one, just because we've talked a lot about the human side of it. So Trung asks, what about database migrations? So I guess you've got a new feature you're working on and it's going to require a new table to be created. How are you going to deal with that? I think that's a good perceptive question to ask, because I think this is actually one of the trickier ones to manage personally. I don't know, Michael, do you have any opinions on that, or like, I guess it probably, I know the consultant's answer is it depends, but what kind of things would you consider if you had a feature with them?
I don't know his first name, KD Jäger, KD Jäger, gave a good first answer to that, but during the last few months, I had a chance to work with a very, very experienced developer, and we are working in a highly distributed microservice scenario, and had to fundamentally change one of the services without ever breaking all its depending services. And the first time I looked at the problem, I thought, oh, this is an easy one, let's just do it. And it took exactly 2 days, and we broke it the first time. And then we kind of, took a long time discussing how we can have a migration plan that works in very small steps and often has, let's say, fallbacks to the previous implementation or the old implementation, while already having the new implementation in place. So we had a lot of duplicated code at some point of time and a lot of duplicated functionality. But the very nice thing that I learned in this exercise was that we, after the first mistake we made, we never ever broke the system again. And I think it takes a lot of engineering practice, and you have to exercise it. It's nothing that you can give an easy answer, but I would say generally think more about the migration path, and maybe have some duplication in place at some points of time, and make sure and optimize for not breaking stuff and not for having redundancy-free code and all this. Maybe that is kind of an answer to this, but I don't know whether it's satisfying.
So I guess in your scenario, let's say where you're building out, I don't know, using a different data store, or you're doing something disruptive, you might, while the feature is off, you might actually have the new schema present in production, or but just that path wouldn't be active in production. Would that be fair to say?
Or you offer two paths in production.
Yeah.
You offer the old path and you offer the new path, and for a certain amount of time you support both. Yeah.
Cool. And I guess that requires you to invest in taking care that you're doing it right. It's not just something that you can just ignore, because if you get it wrong, I guess it wouldn't be great. Do you have anything more to add on that, Kief? You're back from your days as a DBA or anything like that? No? You leave that one alone? Cool. There was one that Yvonne asked that I think is a really good and important question, probably not just for this topic, but for our industry in general at the moment, which was, how do you handle the situation when you have a head of dev who draws part of his identity from being hard and a pain in the ass reviewer, and therefore doesn't like trunk-based development because I guess it removes that opportunity. Any idea of opening up someone like that to the idea? And I can say, everyone, I've definitely encountered this specific challenge more than once in my career. So I think it's a very good question.
I don't have a great answer. I did put in the chat that, you know, it does come down to trust, right? And that is the thing with pull requests in general, is it's about, you know, do you trust people in your team to commit code to the main, and trust that it's a sufficient level of quality, and that, you know, the testing is in place, and so on, that's something you're comfortable doing, without having to kind of gatekeep at a kind of you know, earlier stage of things. And it sounds like what we're talking about is a team lead who really doesn't have trust of the team, which I'm sure leads to a lot of deeper issues than just the, you know, this kind of practice. So that's not an answer.
Experience it. No. It causes bigger problems. That in my experience, this also happens a lot when you have an expanding organization. So you have a startup, a core bunch of people worked on the main product. They probably put a lot of themselves into it, you know, maybe spent late nights fixing stuff, and then they're punished with success. And suddenly their organization is growing bigger and they need to hire more people. And their first thought of how do they maintain their great work that they've managed to feel, how do they make sure it continues to follow their vision? And maybe their first instinct is to try to become a reviewer for everyone's changes. But basically that ends up not scaling. So, you know, in a way, I think if your question, Yvonne, was how to get someone to open up, if that's a scaling problem, you really just need to, well, help them understand that it's just not feasible what they're doing, and that at some stage, even if they think they can manage it now, what happens when the organization and the user base grows another 2 times? At some point, they're going to have to find a new model. And the other thing would be to, like what Kief says, get them to start thinking about the other controls they have on making sure the system isn't broken, like getting their, you know, their input into what makes for a good pipeline or a good set of tests for the problem they have, so that they can spend their time improving the system and not feeling like they have to have their fingerprints on each individual work item. But, you know, with human problems, they are never simple to solve, and I'm sure every individual who is in this situation is going to react slightly different to every other individual.
It also be an experience thing, because especially somebody who's new to a tech lead role, who's, you know, a good, you know, individual contributor, developer, they just may not have the tools, you know, in terms of like ways of working, to be confident that, you know, they have ways of managing the quality of the code and how people are working without personally, you know, having their hands on every commit. And so, you know, maybe there's something there around, you know, finding somebody who can kind of coach and help and support, or just, you know, offer other ways to kind of get over that and get more comfortable. It's a learning journey thing. May or may not be the case in any individual case, but that's often is. I see that.
I would say, I mean, I think there are people out there who are really hard to change and hard to work with, but a culture where you can give and also receive good feedback might help a lot to build a more or better performing team, right? So I don't know how approachable this person is that thinks he or she is the only one to do good code reviews, but maybe you can simply go to her and say, hey, I need a different support than this for me to learn, or can't we try out something new? It doesn't have to be trunk-based development in the first place. It could be some pair programming session where the person who is now only reviewing code could actually start working with you in a different way to share his knowledge and to give you feedback on what you can learn and how you can learn. And the tech lead I'm working right now, we are working on a front-end heavy project at the moment, and I don't have any clue of front-end development. And what he does, he just tried to provide a very solid foundation for the other developers to work in. So he invested a lot of time in making it kind of safe to, first of all, copy and paste a lot of code to get into that and to learn a lot before you have to deal with the with the hard issues around front-end development. That might also be a way how you can support junior people or other people. But I assume that if someone is really, yeah, as you said, the pain in the ass, then you're maybe having a hard time changing the ways of working and making the team performing better or working together in a different way.
Cool, some good advice. Another question that was asked a couple of times, so I want to try to get to it. I guess we probably should we be targeting finishing up about 7:30? Right. Cool. So maybe a penultimate question, which was asked by both Dennis and Hannes in different forms, is how's source code history affected with trunk-based development in your experience? This is Dennis's words. You know, rolling back features, understanding the implementation without documentation. I guess just the clarity of the story that is present in commit history. How's that work when you're doing trunk-based development? I have opinions, though I don't know if you like my opinions, Kief, but yeah. I think my opinion, this is going to put it really bluntly, is trunk-based development does not optimize for the beauty of commit history. And that's something that we have to acknowledge as a trade-off. So if your number one priority, I'm caricaturing this position, is a beautiful source history where the entirety of a change is present and traceable in a single commit that you can just browse off the shelf, just go straight into GitHub and see it, you'll get a more beautiful picture if you're really good with pull request hygiene than you will with trunk-based development, because trunk-based development is interleaving multiple things at once. So you end up with a bit of one, a bit of the other. So I'm comfortable in saying that I'm okay with that because the other benefits that we said about integrating changes earlier give me enough of a benefit that optimizing for the story in the commit history isn't something that I'm going to do.
So let me just, I think you're right, but just to be kind of fair,
Yeah.
I think, because you're using the term like a beautiful commit history, and that's slightly like trivializing, I guess, in a way. I think there's concern there, right? In that the way that some people work, those people who work with pull requests, is in order to kind of, to document basically, a feature and how it's been implemented and so on. Like the pull request creates a convenient mechanism, I think, potentially to do that because it does have that beautiful, history. And so I think, I think it's valid. I think that probably the thing is that we have other ways of doing that, and you have to do that. Again, that's one of those things where people get a bit reactive, is it's like, I know how to do this with pull requests. If you're telling me not to do pull requests, or if I go along with it, not do pull requests and do trunk-based development, I now have to come up with a different mechanism, get used to a different way of doing that, which is kind of a drag.
Michael, do you have any additional to that, the commit history?
I just think that there is more around using the commit history than simply reading it in a terminal. I think there are really good tools nowadays that allow you to group commits to stories and use proper UIs to go through your commits, filter them by what's been done for a specific change. So I don't know whether the only way of making it readable and useful for documentation is having it clean in the first place, or whether you want to rely on some secondary tooling that allows you to do this. Yeah,
I think that's a good point, that it's a common practice when people are doing trunk-based development where commits will be interleaved to have a team convention where, like you said, like you have the story number or some other reference to a Jira ticket, so that you do have that traceability rather than having to be leveraging the Git commit history to make one story, one change.
I think another aspect of the question around this was ability to kind of roll back changes, which I think there again, we probably look at other ways of meeting that requirement, if that's a requirement. And this is probably where feature toggles come in again. And there's a whole other kind of thread in the chat around feature toggles and the complexity that they add, and then potentially the mess that they can add if you're not disciplined about them. So I think that's again one of those trade-offs and one of those things you have to work out how to do that well. There's somebody else I saw kind of flying by asked about like doing dark launches with trunk-based development, and this is exactly how, right? If you can use feature toggles or an aspect of those to decide, what features you expose in production. So in some ways that can help.
Cool. So we're approaching 7:30. So I might actually ask a very administrative question as the final one. So we've had a few people on the chat ask about recordings. How are we going to be able to make this recording available to either people who came or their friends and associates? Michael.
I think we will send out an email to all the people who officially registered on the Meetup platform. And I will also add it to the Meetup that took place in parallel, so that those attendees have a chance to watch the video. You are free to spread it or ping me or Chris or Kief on Twitter or wherever, and we can send you the link of the recording if you want it. But for the people who did not register in any way, it might be a little hard for us to send it out in the first place, right?
Maybe one of us can tweet it or something once we have it. If there's someone who's really passionate who didn't register.
Okay.
Sounds good.
Then thank you very much for this lively discussion and all those great questions. The slides contain some further references. I think there's not many secret references, but yeah. And yeah, please stay in contact. You can write us an email. You can reach out to us on Twitter, LinkedIn, and the usual channels. Yeah, glad to have you had in the Meetup and wish you all a great evening.
Yeah, thanks for the late awesome questions and discussion. Like, I think, that's what made this conversation so much richer than if it was just, reiterating the same points over and over again. So thanks everyone for engaging. Those people who agree with this and those people who don't, it was lovely to chat.
Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.